Okay, so tracking our involvement in Vietnam. Right after World War II, the United States wants to stop the spread of communism under a policy of containment. And so we're going to do that by giving a lot of money and supplies to the French initially so they can stop the spread of communism. However, once the French are kicked out of Vietnam, then America has to send more involvement, more help. And so if we look at this by president, we can kind of see a change over time. First, we have Truman, who is sending money, send money to French. Then we have Eisenhower, who is afraid of something called the domino theory, which was what? If one country falls to communism, other countries will also turn to communism. So he's going to send lots of money and supplies. And then we get Kennedy. There's a growing threat of the communists. And so the United States is going to send 16,000 military advisors. And they're going to give advice to the South Vietnamese in fighting the communists. What's the best way to do it? Here's what you should do. Here's what you shouldn't do. They're supposed to help them, right? So they're not leading the combat. We don't have Americans necessarily fighting on the front lines, but they're involved. They're helping. That all is going to change, though, under Johnson. And what event? The Gulf of Tonkin incident, right? Where they mistakenly say that a U.S. ship is fired upon by a communist boat. And so they passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that's going to give the president the power to deal with the war. And he is going to escalate the war, escalation policy. So we're going to send more soldiers into fighting over the next 3 years. There are going to be over 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam. Throughout that time period, they are going to be fighting against the Viet Cong. Who are mostly guerrilla style fighters who like do ambushes, they fight in the jungle, and they're communist forces. At the beginning of the war, at least, most Americans agree with containment. At this point, most Americans agree with containment. They want to stop the spread of communism. That does begin to change, however, when many young people begin to protest. Students for Democratic Society is a group of young people, mostly college-age students, who are going to protest involvement of the war, especially in 1967 when they, okay, sounds good. In 1967, when they changed the rules and say that if you go to college, that means you're not automatically deferred. You have to get good grades in college in order to be deferred from the draft. So many young people are going to protest. But still, for the first couple of years, most Americans will continue to agree with containment and not really big fans of the protesters. Until in 1968, what's the turning point with America's support for the war? The Tet Offensive. Right, where supposedly they're going to have a truce, they're not going to fight, and the communists launched this huge operation that they've been planning for months. And who won on the battlefield? The Americans won on the battlefield. However, back home, Americans are like, well, wait a minute. I thought the communists were almost going to surrender. This doesn't sound like they're going to surrender. Is the president lying to us? And if the president is lying to us about this, what else are they lying to us about? And so this made, for the first time, to the point where most Americans feel like it was a mistake to go in Vietnam. Still at this point, a majority of Americans are not supportive of protesters, but most Americans are saying maybe we shouldn't be in Vietnam. In 1968, this push against the war is becoming so palpable that President Johnson decides not to run for re-election. And instead, who wins the election in 1968? President Nixon. Nixon is going to follow the polling. He's going to realize that there is this anti-war feeling, but it's a group of Americans who still are very pro-patriotic. They're anti-protesters, but they want to be done with the war. And so he's going to lead into that. You want to get the door. There's a policy called Vietnamization, where they give more power for the fighting to the South Vietnamese and start to withdraw U.S. troops. They're also going to be anti-protesters, although he would not use that phrase. Instead, he would use the phrase law and order. Law and order president. Okay? Don't be going off protesting and having these big displays in the streets and everything. But young people are going to continue to protest, especially because during this time, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds in most states could not vote. They could be drafted and sent to fight and die in Vietnam, but they couldn't vote. And so many of these young people, these college-age students, are using their only voice they can in protest. It wouldn't be until after the war that they created a new amendment to the Constitution saying that you can't, or 18-year-olds are allowed to vote. Okay, 18-year-olds allowed to vote. That's a new amendment that comes out after the war. We have Vietnamization, we have law and order president, and we have the, you want to just unlock it. Kent State shootings. Remember, young people are protesting because Nixon kind of goes back on his Vietnamization plan, and he increases involvement in now Cambodia. And they say, well, wait a minute, we're supposed to be ending the war, not starting a fight in a whole new country. Now, what most Americans didn't know is that we had actually been involved in Cambodia and Laos for quite a while before this. This is when it's getting public. And so they're protesting, and the Ohio National Guard comes out, fires into the crowd, even though they haven't shown any violence, even though no one was hurt by this. They fire into the crowd. 4 college students are killed, and most Americans in polling support the National Guard and are against the protesters, showing that there is this heavy emphasis still on law and order that Nixon is trying to say. Like, you can be against the war, but don't protest. Well, it might be easy for someone who can vote, but if you're 18 or 19 years old and you're going to be drafted and you don't have any political power, it's kind of a, yeah, anyway. But through Vietnamization, a number of troops are decreasing month after month, to the point in 1973 where almost no combat troops are left in Vietnam. After Nixon is ousted because of Watergate, we have President Ford, who takes over. And Ford is like, okay, we promised the South Vietnamese we would help them by giving them money and supplies, and we should keep doing that. But at this point, Congress is like, we don't want to spend any money in Vietnam. And so during Ford's presidency, he tries to help the Vietnamese, but Congress says no, and the communists take over Vietnam. So some big effects. 1971. So, the effects of the war. First of all, we have the 26th Amendment. Voting age is 18. Could a state say their voting age is 16? They could, they just can't go above 18. Okay. Can't go above. We have 26th Amendment. We have things like the War Powers Act, which kind of came out after Nixon to take away power from the president. Take war powers back. People become more distrusting of their government after the Vietnam War. There's something called the credibility gap, where people begin to distrust the government. Before this time, Americans were just like, oh, if the president says it, it has to be true. The president wouldn't lie. Now, after the Vietnam War, Americans are more like, maybe they could. 58,000 Americans are killed. Over 100,000 are wounded. Millions of Vietnamese people are either killed or wounded, and costing America billions and billions of dollars. Yes. Against the war, that'd be after Tet Offensive. Okay, that's the big turning point. But again, there's this weird, like, and I think I shared this with second hour yesterday. I don't think I shared it with fourth hour. There's a group of doves who are anti-war and pro-protesters. There's the Hawks, who are pro-war and anti-protesters for law and order. And there's this group in the middle, and I don't know what the name is. People don't really talk about them in the textbook, but they're there. They're people who at the beginning of the war were pro-war, but became anti-war. But throughout the whole time were anti-protesters. I don't know the name for these people. That's historians have kind of skimmed over these people, and I think that's a really important group to look at, because at the beginning of the war, most Americans agreed with containment and said, yes, let's go and stop communism, right? Showing there's mostly pro-war. But then by the time we get to the Tet Offensive and casualty rates are rising month after month, and Americans feel like there's a credibility gap and the president's lying, that's when these people stay pro-war, but many will switch to anti-war. But while they're still anti-war, they're like, oh, you shouldn't protest about it. You shouldn't go off and talk bad about the president or the government or something. Like, don't talk bad about America, right? That's this group. Okay, we should make a change, but don't talk bad, don't protest. And I think a big difference between these groups is age gap. It's typically younger, more middle-aged. That makes sense? Okay. Any more questions about the Vietnam War? I don't have a name. I don't have a name. Northern Flicker? I don't know. Okay, we're going to end there today, everybody. Tomorrow in SB 30, we'll have a little bit more time. I'll talk about civil rights movement quickly, and I'll talk a little bit more about the 1970s. There will also be a review session Thursday morning I think Thursday morning, I'll highlight a little bit more about chapter 28, because some groups are getting more about chapter 28, some are getting less. That'll be Thursday morning. Okay? Thank you, everybody.